I am of the opinion that no library or spiritual library is quite complete without at least one of Alan Watts' books. I believe that Alan Watts put the Zen in Buddhism. And I don't know if it's his voice or the way that he delivers his content, but I find it so refreshing, so like detached with a non-detachment type of feeling, and so easy to, or maybe the word I want to use is relatable. Relatable. It feels like religion with no religion. It's just the way of life, I think, a way of life that you can embody through deep thinking and introspection. A little background on Alan Watts, since we're going to be bringing him up and center. He's sitting in the back over here waiting for my introduction, so I'm not going to delay it. Alan Watts was a prominent British philosopher, writer, and speaker, and he was recognized for interpreting and promoting Eastern philosophy by making it accessible to the Western audience. He was born in Chislehurst, Kent, England, and in his teen years, he was presented with the opportunity to travel to France with a wealthy Epicurean by the name of Francis Crawshaw, who influenced him in the area of Buddhist beliefs and practices. Alan also learned Chinese and also began researching Zen Buddhism. Eventually, he settled in California, the United States, and accepted a position in the faculty of the American Academy of Asian Studies in San Francisco. He also volunteered for the KPFA radio station. He wrote over 25 books. One of his most international bestseller was the one titled The Way of Zen. During his travels to Europe, he also encountered psychiatrist Carl Jung, and on his return to America, Watts began exploring the subject matter of modern science and psychology with the aim to establish an alignment between mystical experiences and those material theories of the universe. He also began experimenting with psychedelic drugs, and I'm now wondering if it was his association with Carl Jung that made him, try the psychedelics. Anyway, that's for another topic and another research, right? Either way, very eclectic gentleman, very loved in the community, and really allowed the West to understand the East philosophy of Zen Buddhism in a very light-hearted way. And hopefully this will be transmitted in this book that I'm introducing to the channel, titled Still the Mind, An Introduction to Meditation. A quote by Alan Watts. What I am really saying is that you don't need to do anything, because if you see yourself in the correct way, you are all as much extraordinary phenomenon of nature as trees, clouds, the patterns in running water, the flickering of fire, the arrangement of the stars, and the form of a galaxy. You are all just like that, and there is nothing wrong with you at all. End of quote. Publisher's Preface by Mark Allen. Alan Watts became famous in the 1950s as a brilliant, intense intellectual, a former Episcopalian priest with a vast knowledge of both Eastern and Western religious and spiritual traditions. Unlike most of his peers, though, he embraced and actually practiced the various traditions he studied. His understanding, expressed through a great number of books and public talks, was peerless. In the 1960s, he became a serious student of Zen Buddhism and was a teacher and eventually dean at the American Academy of Asian Studies, now CIIS, the California Institute of Integral Studies. The popularity of his books and talks soared. He gave a weekly talk on San Francisco public radio that was broadcast nationally. A large number of people listened every Sunday morning. Many considered it their church service. Watts lived on a houseboat in Sausalito, just north of San Francisco, which became renowned as a center of endless discussions, parties, and meditation sessions with famous and infamous spiritual leaders, gurus, intellectuals, writers, and others continually dropping by. He continued to practice his meditation, and his writing and talks deepened. More and more, he was leading people into meditation and spiritual experience rather than just talking about it. In the last years of his life, he left the houseboat and retreated to a small, isolated cabin deep in the woods. He spent nearly every morning alone, usually beginning with a Japanese tea ceremony, followed by a period of meditation and contemplation. Then he would write. His writing and speaking grew quieter and deeper. This book has been transcribed from recordings of several talks he gave in his later years. They show a maturity and an understanding of his subject that only comes after years of meditation. He had transformed over the years from a serious intellectual to a joyous, spontaneous lover of life. His words are still leading edge, as fresh today as when they were spoken many years ago. He is a writer and a student and teacher who will be remembered, and this book shows us why. He is able to use words to take us beyond them. He is able to instill in readers and listeners not only an understanding of meditation, but an actual spiritual experience as well. Introduction by Mark Watts. In the beginning of Still the Mind, Alan Watts mentions the gift he had been given. And it was a unique gift. Watts was able to take his readers and listeners on a journey beyond the often ignored limitations of calculation and reckoning. Perhaps the greatest part of this gift was his ability to show us how to discover simple ways of getting out of the mental trap we create for ourselves. In our modern society, it has become apparent that the power-based world, the world of politics, government, and international finance that influence all of us, has been absolutely hypnotized and driven crazy by words and by thoughts. We have become slaves to recurring patterns in an endless stream of words. Our political leaders talk incessantly about our many problems, but it's as if they're speaking a foreign language one might call memorandese. Almost everyone has had the experience of watching a political debate and wondering afterward what on earth the candidates were talking about. To some degree, all civilized people are out of touch with reality because we fail to distinguish between the way things are and the way they are described. For politicians, this dichotomy has reached extreme proportions, but it affects everyone. We confuse money, which is an abstraction, with real wealth. We confuse the idea of who we are with the actual experience of our organic existence. During the 60s and early 70s, Alan Watts lectured at universities and blossoming growth centers across the country. To help his audiences better understand their connection with the world, he would describe in great detail the many ways that our organic existence inseparably connects us to the entire world. Starting when I was 16 and on into my early 20s, I followed along whenever I could with a portable tape deck, recording his talks. Whether the title of his talk was Ecological Awareness, the Psychology of Mystical Experience, or The Practice of Zen Meditation, he would often return to the theme of the inseparability of man and world. It was something he grasped on a deep level and could invariably help his audiences understand. His essential point was that one's actual organic being is inseparable from the universe. But the distinct idea you have of this distinct wiggle of the whole universe, which you call your body, can very easily persuade you to accept the illusion that you are a separate entity. One reason we fall for the idea of the separate, isolated self is that even though we admire the beauty of the natural world, nearly everyone who has grown up in Western society has certain misgivings about actually living as an integral part of nature. Instead, we adopt certain conventions that allow us to live in modern society. We cultivate our consciousness in order to rise above the level of natural instinct. At one extreme, we are rugged individualists who feel the need to conquer the physical world and claim new territory for mankind. But even those who do not try to dominate the world in a physical sense may try to overcome what they perceive as their animal nature through the repression of their natural desires. We see this manifested nearly everywhere in our culture in conscious attempts to adhere to abstract ideals of virtuous living. But as Carl Jung wrote in his essay, The Stages of Life, that instinct cares nothing for consciousness. Like my father, Jung believed that the problems we have are manifestations of our consciousness, and more particularly the direct result of self-consciousness and our attempt to make things better. This is at the root of so many of the dilemmas we create in so many areas of our lives. Look at the issue of ecology, for example. Although we sincerely want to get along with nature and not destroy it, we still see ourselves as people living separately from the natural world. We are still not a part of it, due to a trick of perception that many people have called the ego. In reality, the whole problem is a mental trap, and the only way out of the trap is to wake up and simply be in the real world. It is necessary, therefore, to experience the real world directly. But here we run into a problem because some people believe that the real world is the spiritual world and others believe it as the physical world. Both of these, however, are simply ideas, concepts. As Alan Watts and so many others keep pointing out, the real art of connecting with the universe is to stop thinking, at least from time to time. Practicing the art of meditation or contemplation can help us stop the perpetual chatter that goes on inside our skulls. As my father often said, a person who thinks all the time has nothing to think about except thoughts and lives in a world of illusions. To the degree we can stop thinking and start experiencing, we are getting back to sanity and to reality. In meditation or contemplation, we can occasionally discover a state of consciousness that is truly not self-conscious. But the only way to do this is by allowing all attempts to mentally describe the world to cease. If we talk all the time, we won't hear what anyone else has to say. And if we think all the time, we will never experience the nature of our organic existence. In the following pages, we will explore what lies at the heart of what may still to this day be considered a new way of thinking and living. As Alan Watts and many others have understood, there is nothing new in it. We are connecting, or reconnecting, with an energy as old as the universe, and with a form of wisdom at least as old as the human race. Well understood by indigenous peoples and brilliantly taught by Buddhists and Hindus. In Still the Mind, We are taken on an experiential journey. By participating in the experiments suggested, you will find a way to get back in touch with the reality that exists beyond our thinking, the great unified reality our thoughts are supposed to represent but can never capture or express. Alan Watts says it much more clearly than I do, and it has been a gratifying experience for me to spend so much time with the hundreds of hours of his words that were recorded on tape. He is a speaker and writer whose voice has continued to have a great impact many years after his passing, and I believe it is well worth spending a few quiet hours from time to time with the book you're holding in your hands. You will see how he used words and thoughts to guide us beyond our words and thoughts, and you will come to understand that we are far greater, far more miraculous in our nature than our words can express. Part 1. The Essential Process of the World. Chapter 1. Who we are in the universe. I was taught when I was a little boy that it was good to be unselfish and loving, and I used to think that I should grow up to serve other people. But after a while, I found out that unless one has something to give people, there is nothing one can do to help them. Just because I thought I ought to help, it didn't mean that I had anything to give. Gradually, over the years, as I understood what it was that I had received of significance from the world, I realized that these things were never intended as gifts to be given in the usual sense of the word. However much one enjoys the song of birds, they are not singing for the advancement of music, and the clouds are not floating across the sky to be painted by artists. In the words of a Zen poem, the wild geese do not intend to cast their reflection. The water has no mind to retain their image. When a mountain stream flows out of a spring beside the road, and a thirsty traveler comes along and drinks deeply, the traveler is welcome. But the mountain stream is not waiting with the intention of refreshing thirsty travelers. It is just bubbling forth, and the travelers are always welcome to help themselves. So in exactly that sense, I offer these ideas, and you are all welcome to help yourselves. 3 wishes. I'm offering these words for your entertainment and to entertain myself. I'm not trying to improve you, and I really do not know how I would improve you. It would be imprudent for me to recommend any improvements, because one never knows how these things may turn out. And as they say, be very careful of what you wish for, because you may get it. One of the problems when people ask for miracles is that they never know what the miracle they ask for ultimately involves. That is why magicians and genies always grant 3 wishes, so that after the first 2 you can always use the third one to get back to where you began. What invariably happens is that with the first wish, things never quite work out as you expected. You may not realize what it may involve if you wish for a glass to be changed into gold, for instance. If we change the arrangement of the universe in such a way that glass becomes gold, you may suddenly find that your eyesight fails, or you lose all your hair, because that might go with it. We do not understand all the interconnections between things, because in reality, we call things are not really separate from each other. The words and the ideas about them separate them from each other, but they are not separate. They all go with each other, interconnected in one vast vibratory pattern, and if you change it at one point, it will be changed at all sorts of other points, because every vibration penetrates through the entire pattern. Why do you believe? You never really know what is going to happen, and therefore I would not presume to say that you ought to be different than the way you are. I am not a guru in the sense of a spiritual teacher or an authority from which you may expect something more than what you have. When you confer spiritual authority on another person, you must realize that you are allowing them to pick your pocket and sell you your own watch. How can you be certain with any great teacher, or scripture for that matter, that they know what they say they know? You may believe in a religion. That is a choice you have made. But how do you know? And why do you believe? If you believe in something simply because the Bible says it is true, for instance, you do so because you believe that the Bible has the authority to tell you it is true. You may well say that your fathers and mothers and all sorts of reliable people believed it, and therefore you have accepted it on their authority. If you're curious, however, you will also ask, how did they know it was true? Did they, by their light and example, show that they were enormously improved because of their belief? If we look at human history with a clear eye, we see that over an appallingly long period of time, people have not improved very much despite their religions and ideals. When you become a grandfather with 5 grandchildren, as I am, you realize that you are just as stupid as your own grandfather was because you still look at things from your own limited position. And although my grandchildren may think that I am a wise and venerable man with a beard, I know that I am still a child, and I feel pretty much as I have always felt. So when you set someone up as an authority, never forget that the belief that you have in this authority is just your opinion. It rests on our authority. When de Tocqueville said that the people get the government they deserve, he was quite right. We allow the government, whether it be political or spiritual, to get away with it, and so it rests on our authority. This is true also of God. If you believe in God, that God is good, or that God is God at all, it is your opinion. And so God derives from you, and therefore this thought has some very peculiar implications with regard to the government of the universe. Awareness of the source of spiritual authority, understanding that it comes from us, from the people, may imply that there is some sort of democracy in the kingdom of heaven. Of course, it does not overthrow God, except in the sense of a certain kind of God, and most people do not realize that there can be many quite different ideas of God. God does not have to be a monarch. There can also be an organic God. There are also personal and impersonal gods, and there are gods that are neither personal nor impersonal. There are gods that exist and gods that do not exist, and there are gods that neither exist nor do not exist. But whatever you believe God is, it always goes back to you. What does consciousness rest upon? When his disciples approached the great Hindu sage Sri Ramana Maharshi and asked, "Guruji, who was I in my last incarnation?" he would answer, "Who wants to know?" When they asked, "Guruji, how does one attain liberation?" he would reply, "Who is it that wants to attain?" Who is asking the question? It always gets back to you, where it all begins. And what is that? Of course, we might think we know who we are. We have been told who we are, and we bought the story we were told. So you can't really blame anybody else for what you think of yourself. You can't go way back in a sort of psychoanalytical way and find the causation for what you are now. The answer is not in the behavior of your parents or in your peer group or whatever your situation was when you were a child, because the universe doesn't work that way. Instead, it works the other way. It goes backward into the past from you, because you started it. And so when you blame somebody else for putting you into your current situation, it merely means that you have defined yourself incorrectly. Perhaps you have defined yourself as being limited to your conscious attention and limited to your voluntary musculature. But is that all there is? Is that the real you? What does consciousness rest upon? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Who are you? Consciousness does not illumine the lamp from which it shines, just as a flashlight doesn't shine on the battery that powers it. When you make a decision, does that come from somewhere other than you? No, it comes from the depths of you, of which you are not really aware. You encompass far more than anything you know about in a conscious way. But we are so used to thinking of I as simply the center of our consciousness and the center of our will that we ignore or are ignorant of most of ourselves. When you think of a particular person, what do you think of? Suppose I say, think of your uncle or think of your mother. What instantly comes to mind is their face, because we are most accustomed to seeing photographs and images of faces. When we see images of the president, most often it is the president's face, the head and shoulders, and only occasionally the whole body seen. What do you think of when you think of a flower? In the same way, you think mostly of the blossom, sometimes of the stalk, and occasionally of the whole plant. But very rarely when we think of a flower, do we think of the flower out in a field. We would say, that's more than the flower. The flower is not the field. But is that so? Where would the flower be without the field? I can say in words, the flower grows in the field. In words, I can chop the field off and say, the flower grows, and the phrase will still make sense. However, it will not make sense in nature. If I take the field away from the flower cannot grow. The flower is connected with the field in a very deep way, and so in the same way, a person is not just their head. The head has to go with the body, and the body has to go with a social and natural environment, but we never think of it that way. We know it is all there, but it doesn't come to mind automatically. So who are you? And who decides on the limits of an organism? Who are you that gives spiritual authority to somebody else and then pretends, of course it does not come from me. I bow down because I know that person really knows. Now the Buddhists have a very funny trick when it comes to bowing, because Buddhists do not have the idea of a supernatural authority that watches over them. So why, then, do they bow when they pay respect to a Buddha? Why do they bow when they meet you and greet you so reverently? Bowing is paradoxically the act of a king because it confers authority. The one who bows sets the revered image on its pedestal. And if there were no one to bow, there would be no image on the pedestal. You put it there, but again you would ask, how could it be so that what puts the authority up there is just poor little me, who is neurotic or sinful and doesn't really even understand what's going on. But fundamentally, the you that does this is the greater you, which is not just the activity of consciousness, but the whole activity that expresses itself as you sit here and read this page. And what is it that expresses itself as you read? And what am I that is called Alan Watts and is offering these ideas? I stated in the beginning that I am doing all this for entertainment, and I meant it. But who is it that is doing this for entertainment? If I say Alan Watts is a big act, who is it that puts on this act? To try to trace the answer down, we might go to an astrologer and ask, who puts on the act? Well, he would say, where were you born and at what time? And he would go and look up the positions of the stars and the planets. And then he would draw a picture of my character, which just happens to be a very crude picture of the universe. There you are, he would say, but I see you've drawn a picture of the universe. I would reply. That may be a surprise to him because he probably thinks of the influences of the stars and of the planets as something that affects me, and that implies a certain separation between the bodies that cast the influences and the puppet that is influenced. But does the root of a flower influence the flower as something fundamentally different from it? No, surely the root and the flower are one process, and like your head and your feet, it all goes together. In that sense, then, the universe and what you or I do all goes together. And so that picture of the universe is really a picture of you. We may not recognize ourselves because we think of ourselves as a chopped off piece surrounded by our skin, and therefore we see ourselves in a rather impoverished way. And this form of perception is almost automatic. We think of ourselves as separate beings who stand alone and move through all sorts of different places but are cut off from the environment. As a result, we have an underlying feeling of alienation, of not really belonging in this universe, and we feel that we are being confronted by something that does not give a damn about us. It was here long before us and will be here long after we are gone. We come into this world for a brief span as a little flash of consciousness between two eternal darknesses. Of course, during our lives, all sorts of other things go on, but nevertheless, the feeling that haunts almost everybody is that this I is an orphan here on a visit, and we don't feel that we really belong here. In the same way, what do you feel when you look out at those galaxies? If you go out into a desert or up in the mountains where the sky is clear, you see this colossal affair that you are involved in. It makes a lot of people feel very small, but it shouldn't. It should make you feel as big as it is, because it is all inseparably connected with what you call you. The tremendous whirling of energy is exactly one and the same energy that is looking out of your eyes, that is running along inside your brain, that is breathing, and that makes noises when you talk. The whole energy of the universe is coming at you and through you, and you are that energy. The nature of energy. Well, we say, but surely we die and we disappear. We turn into dust, and this will go on long after I am gone. The whole nature of energy, however, is that it is a vibration, and a vibration is a wave, and a wave has a crest and a trough. It is like a pulse. It goes on and it goes off, and everything goes on and off. Things like light go on and off so quickly that you can't see the off, because by definition, on is always a little bit more noticeable than off. It is positive, whereas off is negative. The outside of things is vibration, but because it goes very fast, we don't quite sense it, and therefore it seems constant or solid, like the blades of an electric fan. This is true of light and also true of sound, but when you hear a very deep sound, it vibrates noticeably. You can hear the texture in it. You can hear the vibrations going on and off. When you hear a great pipe organ, the whole building shudders with these vibrations. We barely notice most of the pulses, however, including the slower pulses created by the turning of the earth, the cycles of the tides, or the coming and going of the equinoxes. These are very slow vibrations, but they always go on and then off. We are aware of these changes only because of the contrasts within them. Of course, you would not know something was on if it did not occasionally go off, and you would not know it was off if it did not sometimes go on. So I have often asked the question, how would you know you are alive unless you had once been dead? Where would you be without nothing? Where were you before you were born? Where will you be when you die? We may think we will become nothing, but what we don't realize is that nothing, in its own way, is as important as something. Where would you be without nothing? What is the background to being if it is not non-being? You have to have nothing to have something. It is so simple. But nobody sees it because it is a fundamental to Western philosophy that out of nothing comes nothing. But how can that be? According to our logic, in order for something or someone to come out of nothing, there must be some kind of hidden structure inside nothing. It must contain some sort of inner workings out of which something comes. But this is not the case at all. The whole point is that there is no concealed structure, and it is just because it is honest to goodness plain, nothing that something comes out of it. That is elementary logic, but no one sees it because everybody is afraid of nothing. People think, well, if it's nothing, it will never be something again because that's going to be the end. The theologians get this mixed up too, and even someone like St. Thomas Aquinas believed that out of nothing comes nothing, and then he said, God created the world out of nothing. He made a mistake because he tried to identify God exclusively with being, and of course you cannot have being without non-being. The Hindus understand this, as well as the Buddhists, who inherited their philosophy and mythology. They say God is neither being nor non-being. It is what they have in common. Yet nobody can say what that is. And still, you know perfectly well that being and non-being go together, like an inside and an outside, a front and a back, a top and a bottom. Being and non-being are polarities, like the North and South poles. What is in between? Nobody really knows because you can only know what you can compare with something else. You can know something only because you can compare it with nothing, and vice versa. But nobody knows what to compare with that which is common to both something and nothing. It is for that same sort of reason that you cannot see for yourself the color of consciousness. What's the color of eyesight? We know all the colors because they are different from each other. We see different colors in a mirror. But what is the color of the mirror? We may say silver, but it isn't really. Although a mirror will reflect a silver spoon as something different from something else, the mirror is a non-color. We can't compare it with any other color, and so it is transparent to our consciousness. And like your consciousness, and like space, it is a big nothing. Most people treat space and consciousness as if they were not there. Yet suppose there wasn't any space, only solid. There would be no outside the solid, and no one would know if it was round or square, because there would be nothing to compare it to, and it would be all there would be. It would appear rather dense, but of course most of what we call something is largely nothing when you get down to atoms. Whatever it is they are really made of, it's vast distances apart, and when we get to the inner structure of atoms, we find precious little there. It is a lot of nothing, and this nothing turns out to be very powerful stuff. Everything goes around. In order to have room to move around, you have to have a void to move around in. And moving around is energy, which is definitely something. So that is the sort of thing we are in, and that is the sort of thing we are. We are not just in it, we are it. And it vibrates, it oscillates, and it goes around. The cycles are not just simply wave motions or undulations. They are also cycles of a circular kind. Everything goes around, just as when we dance we go around. And it is tremendously important to get hold of this principle of going around. We are in a phase of the life of mankind when we seem to have forgotten that cyclic quality. Instead of going around, we all think we are going somewhere, and that implies there is somewhere else to go. But as I wander along, I can't help but wonder where that other place would be. Higher orders of being. In the same way, when we think of evolution, we think of a scale and of a hierarchy of different sorts of beings. We might think, for example, that above us there are angels, and then gods, with attending bodhisattvas going up to we know not what heights of amazing human development. And then we think that below us are the other mammals, perhaps demons, insects, bacteria, plants, rocks, down to we know not what depths. So we congratulate ourselves and say how great it is to be human and not to be a cat, not to be a rose and not to be a fish. And we think how much better it will be when we can get to be angels. We human beings are very conceited, and we think we can get up there and be gods or Buddhas. But how do you know that you are a higher order of being than a potato? What do you really know about potatoes anyway? You probably never studied potatoes beyond knowing how to cook and eat them. That's probably about it. But have you ever thought about how a potato feels? Well, you say, it doesn't feel, it's only a potato. It has nothing to feel with. But wait a minute. When you put a lie detector on a potato, some kind of skin response machine, it certainly registers, and its readings change when you do certain things. If you prick the potato or shout at it, it will flinch. As a matter of fact, if you learn how to turn on your alpha waves and you sit beside a plant, you will find that it will pick up those alpha waves. So maybe plants are not so stupid after all. Well, we might say, how can it be? It has no civilization. It has no house. It has no automobiles. It has no pianos, no art galleries, and no religion. But the potato might say, I don't need them. It's your poor, uncivilized human beings who have to have all this crap around you to tell you who you are and what it's all about. You are messy and inefficient, and you are cluttering up the planet with your culture. But I, the potato, have it all built into me. Well, we might say, that's impossible, because you are stuck in one place all the time. How can you know anything about the world? But the potato doesn't need to go running around, because its sensitivity extends all over the place. And so it might say, I want to introduce you to a few things. There's my neighbor over here, the thistle. Have you ever seen how my thistle neighbor gets around? It has tiny seeds with down sticking all over them. And when the wind comes, these seeds float off into the air. And my neighbor, the maple tree, has little helicopters it sends off, and they spin in the air and fly away. And then I have a friend, the apple tree, and it has fruit that is so delicious that the birds like it. They eat the apple and swallow the seeds, then they fly away, and when they drop the seed, it is sown. These are incredible devices. Others have burrs that stick in the hides of deer, and they carry these seeds around. This is one of the ways we get around, and we spread our people so that we aren't all crowded together and don't strangle ourselves. The potato would go on to explain, but this is only the beginning of the extraordinary things that we do. We have vibrations going on inside our fibers that are quite as good as anything invented by your Bach and Mozart. We enjoy this, and although you may think we are not doing anything because we just sit here all the time, we are vibrating, and we are in ecstasy. We are humming to the great hum that is going on everywhere. Your plants may be in such an advanced state of consciousness that, unknown to you, angels are growing in a flower pot at your door. Unbeknownst to you, they may have a great deal to do with the way you think. Consider also that the humble fly may be extremely intelligent too. With all those eyes, he sees a complex relationship of perspectives, and with the ability to walk upside down on the ceiling, he may have a certain perspective that is far beyond yours. Whatever do flies do when they buzz? What is it all about? We don't know, because we don't even know how to begin to study them. It took many years to find out that bees communicate with each other by dancing, and that was such a shock that one entomologist at UCLA said, I have the most passionate reluctance to accept this evidence. It is a shock to find out that dolphins, for example, may be more intelligent than people, and that so-called killer whales are a very intelligent kind of dolphin. Look at those creatures. They are mammals, and it is said, although we are not sure if this is true, that they once lived on the land. Apparently they decided that being on the land is a pretty stupid way for a mammal to live, and they said, let's go skin diving. They said, you really don't have to do much for a living, and you can dance and play. And so dolphins spend most of their time simply fooling around, and they fool around in a very complicated ways. If we were dolphins, we would call this art. When we practice any art, we are, in a way, just fooling around. We mix a lot of paint and make beautiful patterns on flat surfaces or on textured surfaces. We put together all kinds of boxes with pluckable wires, little tubes that we can blow our breath through, and enormous tubes that we can blow breath through mechanically. We stretch great taut skins that we bang with our fists or with sticks, and do all kinds of other things. When a symphony orchestra gets up on a stage, it is essentially just a lot of baboons blowing through holes, and yet this is something very important. There is a hush. The concert master comes in, and everybody applauds and sits down. The concert master then summons the orchestra into being, and people in their tiaras and pearls and ties sit back because this is culture and is very serious. The whole atmosphere of the concert hall is very proper, like a church. It is a little different when a rock band takes over, and there is a light show and everything is just blowing. And this is authentic music, and it is very important music. Perhaps this is the continuation of the great Western tradition. The concert hall is good for classical music, but as the new artists take over with their rather sophisticated new music, musicians like the Beatles and the Grateful Dead continue the tradition, but it is done in a different spirit. That music is a celebration, and there is nothing setting about it. It's music to groove with, to be right there with, because you are not pretending that you are doing something important in a solemn sense. You are doing something important because you are right in the belly of things, and you're moving with it. All of the vegetables understand this, and so from their point of view, they are very highly evolved beings. Perhaps they don't consider us inferior beings and just regard us as something different, but we are very unfair to vegetables. When at last a human being approaches the end of life and lapses into a coma, we say, "Poor old so-and-so, he's just a vegetable." Or when somebody is lazy, we say, "They're just vegetating." Now that shows a lack of compassion toward vegetables. The word compassion means to feel with or to have passion with. If you have compassion for vegetables or for flies or mushrooms or viruses, what it means is that you have put yourself in their position. When you begin to really empathize, you discover that they think of themselves as people, and they have just as much right to think that they are civilized and cultured as you and I do. So what does that do to our perception of an ordered universe? Think about it for a moment in human terms. For one thing, most of the people we call primitive are far less violent and less diabolical than we are as a society. They live more peaceable lives, and even though the tools they use are not as developed or complex as ours, they are very dignified, civilized people. They certainly are not savage. Many primitive peoples look at us with grave concern. They don't regard us as civilized at all. Instead, they view us as a rather serious menace to the planet because we are out of touch with the ecology of nature and tend, on the whole, to be extraordinarily miserable. Some of the richest places I know of are full of wealthy people who are really amazingly miserable because, despite their tremendous resources, they are always worrying about their health, their taxes, politics, or losing their money. You can always worry about something if you are the worrying type, and it doesn't matter how rich you are or how poor you are. A place called you. As you carefully observe the cycles of life, a very strange kind of relativity begins to take root in your consciousness. Everywhere on a sphere is the same place, because there is as much east of you as there is west of you. And by the same logic, any point on the surface of the sphere is the center of the circle. Furthermore, if we live in a curved space-time continuum, any planet can be regarded as the center of the whole universe, and therefore any person on a planet stands in the situation of God, and that circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. So when you want to become something more than you are, different from what you are, or higher than where you think you are, all that means is that you haven't discovered where you are, and you are under the illusion that there is somewhere else that you might ought to be besides here. What we are engaging in here is a journey to the place where we are, and I would like to describe to you some of the peculiarities of this journey. It is a sort of Alice in Wonderland story because it is full of paradoxes. If I say, we're going on a journey to where we are, a journey to the center of the universe and to the middle of space and time, and it's a place called you. People will invariably begin to pass judgment about one's progress along the way. They will say things like, I think this person is more aware than somebody else. He's more than so-and-so is. Then we begin to think about the stages one goes through in getting to be more where they are than they were before. You find this particularly in sophisticated circles where people are concerned with spiritual and psychological development. And with religion, some very curious games are played, and many of them are forms of spiritual one-upmanship. People become concerned with being more humble than other people. Passing judgments. Suppose we were somebody who has a reputation, either deserved or undeserved, for being spiritually evolved. That is the sort of phrase that is usually used. But if they get influenza and feel very sick, people shake their heads and say, if so-and-so were really spiritual, they wouldn't be affected by sickness. We have a funny notion in our heads that truly spiritual people are made of cast iron, that they are not sensitive, so that if you bang them about, it won't affect them. But as the great sixth patriarch of China pointed out, you must learn to distinguish between a living Buddha and a stone Buddha. Because if a Buddha was simply one who was not affected by anything, then lumps of wood and pieces of stone would be Buddhas. And perhaps they are in their own way. But that wasn't the point he was making. His point was that if you think that the greatest ideal in life is to be invulnerable, then you are on your way to becoming geological rather than spiritual. This kind of spiritual geology is very prevalent if you know spiritual people as well as I do. I perpetually hear tales of people insisting that my guru is better than yours. This goes on insufferably, whether it is my minister, my church, my society, or my own organization. I have heard all the reasons why, and I have heard people putting down other teachers and gurus, saying how dreadful it is that such and such a Zen master made them do so and so. Or we hear of the yogi who is a drunk, or sleeps with his students, or gambles, or drives cars too fast. A great many spiritual people in this country are actually crypto-Protestants and still believe strongly in the Protestant ethic. Therefore, they pass all of these judgments, despite the fact that the founder of the Christian religion said, "Judge not that you be not judged." All the different performances of the universe. If you look at all the religions and all the different kinds of practices that people are doing in the same way that you look at different kinds of vegetables and different kinds of flowers and insects and butterflies, you will see that while yogis are assuming one perspective and Baptists are assuming another, what they are all really doing is a different kind of dance. And you can accept this and look at it with absolute amazement and say, wow, look at all these different performances this universe is doing. If you do this, you tend to stop griping and arguing about which one is the right one. Of course, you may not accept all the performances entirely. You may not agree with their points of view. I must admit that I have some prejudices. I don't like the flavor of some Bible Belt religions because I find them exceedingly depressing. I also don't like boiled onions. They're distasteful as well. On the other hand, I can worship with the Roman Catholics and the Episcopalians and the Theosophists and Hindus and Muslims and feel perfectly at ease because I find that they are all doing the same thing in different and fascinating ways. Sometimes I draw the line, but I know when I do that, it is nothing more than a personal prejudice, and I am entitled to some because I am human. After all, to be human, you have to have within you a touch of rascality. When God created Adam, He put in him just a touch of that wayward spirit, in the same way that one adds a little salt to a stew. If this slight oddity, this bit of unpredictability, had not been there, nothing would ever have happened, because Adam would never have tasted the apple. A pinch of rascality. Once, Carl Jung felt that he had met a man with no human failings at all, and he was terribly disturbed because it made him feel guilty. He thought that he should probably take a closer look at himself. Then a day or two later, Jung met the man's wife, and he ceased to worry about it. It wasn't because she had said, "You should know my husband is very difficult to live with." That wasn't the story at all. Instead, the wife embodied all the things that were repressed in her husband, because when you live together that intimately, you begin to share your psychic life. So if one becomes too much of a light, their partner may grow compensatory and become a shadow, and vice versa. So there has to be the element of rascality, but not too much, just a pinch of it. When I come across somebody who does not appear to have it, especially so-called spiritual people who are very pure and sincere, I always suspect they are unconscious of human nature. There's something about these solemn pures that makes me feel uncomfortable, because I like people I can let my hair down with. The hierarchy of life. You may find this is disconcerting, however, because then you begin to wonder, is there no perfect human being? Isn't there somebody up there, a great being who we can all look up to and respect? Or are saints and saviors pretty much like anyone else? When you look closely at the idea of the hierarchy of life, you realize that even someone as remarkable as Jesus Christ, who from a Buddhist point of view would be considered a great bodhisattva, can emerge at any level. According to the Buddhist idea of reincarnation, we have all occupied every position in the hierarchy, or on the wheel of becoming, as the Buddhists call it, since the image of time they use is a wheel. In this view, by moving around the wheel, you eventually realize that every position to which you can shift is the same position you were always in. While you are shifting, you may feel there is a change going on, but once you have settled into your new position, it feels like any other settled position always felt. From the inside, we know what it feels like to have a settled position, because from time to time we can change. But, as the French say, the more it changes, the more it remains the same. We who live in a fidgety culture are apt to feel that this is an awfully boring philosophy, and that we are not going to get anywhere because there is no real progress. But, on the other hand, suppose there is a possibility of real advancement and improvement. Use your imagination to the best of your ability and figure out exactly and in detail where would you rather be, and who would you rather be than who you are. If you work on this for a while, somebody who is ingenious enough will always be able to point out to you that you have left something out, and that there is something else you could improve upon. You can go on, and as you go about this imaginative creation of the perfect life, you will eventually realize that what you are really doing is extending power. The process is very much like the people who are now working on gene manipulation so that man can direct the future of evolution, and we can breed intellectual Einsteins, physical Elizabeth Taylors, and moral Sister Teresas. All of these people had extraordinary direction as human beings by virtue of their integrity and ingenuity. And so some people may look at this idea and think it would be just great. But look how we have extended our power now. We may think it would be good to be in charge of evolution. But along comes the old problem of the three wishes again. How do we know which way is really better? When human beings begin to attempt to take charge of evolution, they do so using their minds and a kind of consciousness that scans the world and looks at everything serially. But the problem is that the world itself is not serial. The world is what we call multi-dimensional, which is to say that everything is happening all together everywhere at once, and going along much too fast for us to take adequate cognizance merely through a scanning procedure. Because scanning is confined to linear limits, it always leaves things out, and these things may be very important. That is why, as I pointed out before, turning the glass into gold may mean that your eyesight will fail or your hair will fall out. When we bring about change with our quite limited vision, and when we change people by altering their genes, we certainly will have a new situation, but it will not necessarily be any better because we are unable to see in advance the fullness of the role that every individual will play. In terms of projecting power, you will see that the geneticists' power is limited because they have a limited view. If we decide to give them all the computers they need to add it all up so that they all will have a complete view of life, we are then placing ourselves in a position to control life on the planet. This is to be the final creation, and we are trying to carefully arrange it with our seemingly vast intellect and omnipotent consciousness. We are to be the master magicians. We are to have complete control over ourselves, and nothing is to happen that is not in accordance with our will. Yet suppose we do all this, and suppose we have even managed to will our will so that it is always a good will. I'm not quite sure how we would know it was a good will unless there was a possibility for bad will. But suppose we have managed. Ultimately, you must ask, do I want to be in that kind of situation? In other words, think of where those directions we speak of as progressive are really going and extrapolate on them. Perhaps you will say, of course, I wouldn't do that because I realize I'm never going to get there. But even so, why are you even heading in that direction? Are you sure it's a better direction to go in? After all, we kill more people with cars than we do with wars. And you have to think about things like that. I'm not arguing that we should not have technological development, but perhaps it is short-sighted to conclude automatically that they are improvements. They may not be improvements at all in the long run, and so it is very important to consider whether you want to control the direction in which you are heading. Full of surprises. Inwardly, do you really and truly want to have power over everything that occurs within the sphere of your consciousness? Perhaps, speaking as a man, I would like to cast a spell over a woman so that she could become exactly as beautiful as I could conceive beauty to be, and so that every inflection of her voice and gesture would obey me like a violin under the hand of a perfect master. I would entirely direct her actions, and although in her every action she would be my dream, I would quickly begin to worry about this Frankenstein woman. I would think that perhaps there was nobody home, and that all I had done was to create a machine. When I think about it, what I really want is for her to do something that I don't expect. That is one of the reasons why it is so nice when we have an occasion to give gifts. We love surprises because a surprise means there was someone else there, someone who made it fun by doing something that we could not have predicted. I've heard people who think that in the future, due to our psychic development, we are all going to be able to read each other's minds. Through direct transference from one mind to another, we will have access to everybody's thoughts, and there will be no privacy left. Of course, since everybody will be completely transparent to everyone else, we won't be able to surprise each other. Personally, I'm not looking forward to that kind of world, because I'm afraid it will be quite devoid of spontaneity. We may lose that little element we call vitality. Now, this may sound as if I'm saying the best sort of thing is not a universe where we realize that there is a profound underlying unity through all things, but rather a universe that is pluralistic, that is not one at all. Certainly, it may be said that one of the best parts of life is having lots of separate things all surprising each other, but I see still a different scheme. The world I see is what we might call unity in diversity. What we call self and what we call other are like something and nothing. They are fundamental polarities which, just because they contrast each other, have something in common. We cannot say what it is, though, and therefore our world will always be full of surprises. End of chapter 1. Let's get more of Alan Watts in the next video, where he's going to help you meet your real self.